Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. This morning, we're going to talk about two main themes that Paul identifies here in Romans 8, verses 18 through 23. The theme of suffering and the theme of hope. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read the first 17 verses of chapter 8, but I do think it's helpful for us to understand what are the main ideas and thoughts Paul presents to the Romans before getting to our section from the epistle reading this morning. Paul discusses first the difference between living a life according to what he calls living in the flesh and living a life according to the Spirit. The life of the flesh is one of bondage and sin. Life according to the Spirit is one of virtue and freedom. After this, Paul goes on to talk about the implications of living a life as children of God. Before going into our reading from this morning, though, I do think it's important to see specifically what Paul says in the verse prior. There he says, "And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together." Notice the connection. Our future glorification is tied to our suffering on earth. But notice the suffering described here is not just suffering in general. It's suffering with Christ so that we might be glorified with him. So when we suffer with Christ, essentially when we suffer for being Christians, and to be clear, this can come from humans, it can come from the demonic, this results in our future glorification with Christ. Now with this in mind, we can turn to our reading from this morning. Paul starts in verse 18 by saying, "For I reckon that the suffering of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." I want you to imagine for a moment the worst form of suffering you can imagine. One might think of the suffering that many of the early church martyrs, or even many martyrs today, face. They were persecuted and suffered before their deaths, usually tortured, and a very drawn-out, horrible death. Paul was certainly writing in an era this was a very real reality to at least some of his audience, if not many. To the best of my knowledge, no one here has suffered this level of suffering, but nonetheless, I also assume that everyone here has at least faced some level of suffering and potentially very severe suffering related to your faith. Before moving on to the very real hope that Paul discusses regarding our suffering, that's going to come in the future, when we are united with Christ in the new heavens and the new earth, I want to speak very briefly about suffering in the moment. How often have you heard someone say in a moment of suffering things like this? Everything happens for a reason. God is in control. This is all part of God's will. If you have enough faith, God will heal you. Have you prayed about this? God doesn't give us more than we can handle. Something similar happened to me. Genuine moments of suffering, let me encourage each of you to do one thing primarily. Just listen. Paul also tells us later in the book of Romans to weep with those who weep. Listen to the one suffering. Weeping with the one suffering is important. You're called to do this as followers of Christ. In those moments, it's not the time to correct someone theologically about how they're viewing suffering. Now, we will, in a moment, build a theological framework for suffering, but I want to encourage everyone here to listen to some, in my estimation, some very wise words once shared. To observe the suffering in reverence and silence with the person who is experiencing it. And just be present, be available, mourn with them, shed tears. Don't be like Job's friends. Quite simply, don't open your mouth. Now, going on the assumption that no one is in a moment of intense suffering, and you aren't, maybe you're not coming to me to share your suffering with me, I do want us to build up a theological framework of suffering. Now, my goal in this isn't to eliminate suffering. Last time I checked, I have no ability to do that. But it is to get it to where in those moments of suffering, you don't forsake Christ. You don't abandon your faith. I also want to acknowledge that my answer to this question will probably not leave you feeling warm and fuzzy. I'm not going to suggest that every instance of suffering here on earth has some greater good that comes from it, though in many instances it might. I'm not going to suggest that every instance of suffering comes from sin, though in many instances it might. But here's my first theological principle that is important. God is never the cause of any suffering. Every instance of suffering is either a form of natural evil, you might think of a tornado killing someone, or moral evil, another human being taking the life of another human being. And God can only cause that which is good. In fact, technically, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, evil is the absence of good. So there is no instance of evil which God can be said to be the cause of. Second, even though God isn't the cause of evil, he is in total control of what happens. This is accomplished by his omnipotence, being all-powerful, his omniscience, being all-knowing, as the creator and sustainer of everything, and by divine providence. So even when evil and suffering happens, we can genuinely and truthfully say that God is fully in control. Third, the moment God decided to create a material universe, there was the possibility of suffering. God, of course, could have made us just like the angels. Angels are non-material beings, and so in that way, they cannot suffer in the way we as humans do. They can commit acts of evil, but as non-material beings, they cannot suffer. Again, at least in the way humans do. Notice what Paul says in verses 19 through 22. There he says the following about creation. Creation longs. It was subjected to futility. It's in bondage to corruption, and it groans. So what should we do with these three principles? First, suffering, at least in the natural sense, is simply part of being a material being. Second, God is never the cause of any act of evil. And lastly, he is still 100% in control of every single thing, event, or action that takes place in reality. So though we don't want to use moments of suffering to explain all of this, we can take these principles to prepare ourselves for those times we encounter suffering. Again, I don't want to suggest for a moment that this theological framework will, in an actual moment of suffering, be in any way helpful. But if we don't have this theological framework established, it's very easy, and this happens quite often, to walk away from Christ in those moments of suffering. Whether it be the death of a young child, someone who suffers long with cancer and then dies, all of these, when we don't have this framework in mind, can lead someone down a path of abandoning their faith. Now let us move on to Paul's other major theme in this section, hope. Now, in our reading this morning, Paul only uses the word hope one time. But in the next two verses, verses 24 to 25, he uses it 5 times. It might be helpful to first define what exactly we mean by this word hope. First, hope, at least the theological virtue of hope, it's not wishful thinking. Paul isn't using the word hope here in the same way that, we're in July. I think the NFL season starts in August, at least the preseason does. He's not using it in the same way that I might say, I hope that the Carolina Panthers actually have a winning season this year. Second, at least here, Paul isn't using the word hope to express some emotion, as in being hopeful. No, the theological virtue of hope is something very, very different. The theological virtue of hope has a few key components. First, it must be about something difficult. For example, our salvation. On our own, this of course is impossible. Second, it must be something in the future. We don't hope for something we already have. Third, it must be about some good. We don't hope for pain. And fourth, it must be something possible to obtain. If it's totally impossible, we would have despair out the gate, not hope. Think of the rich man in Luke 16 who is in Hades. He only has despair because he cannot go to Abraham's bosom. Fifth, and this is what distinguishes what Paul is talking about here and our earthly hopes, God must be the object. If we only have the first 4 components, something difficult, something future, something possible, and something good, then we can say we have hope, just not in the same way Paul is using that term here. With those 4 components, I might hope to run a mile in under 4 minutes. Though one might argue at this phase in life that is impossible, and therefore if I have that goal, I'm probably going to enter into despair. But obviously, there's no guarantee, and in this case, we would likely argue, at least for myself, that is highly unlikely to happen. But if we add in that final component of God being the object of our hope, like Paul does here in Romans 8, this fundamentally changes things. Now, our hope is guaranteed. I do want to make one point of clarification here. If we hope that God will heal us from disease or prevent the death of someone, our hope involves God, but He's not the object of our hope. In those instances, either the individual hoping or some other creature is the object of the hope. But when God is the genuine object of our hope, we can rest with confidence that what Paul says here is true. Here are the things Paul says we can hope for, and in turn have assurance will happen. We will be glorified. Our bodies will be redeemed. We will be adopted as sons by God and have freedom. Also, remember that Paul says that our current sufferings are not worth comparing to our future glory. Even the most intense suffering here on earth will pale in comparison to even the smallest glory in the new heavens and the new earth. In moments of suffering, we can take peace and comfort in that reality. Though again, to be clear, if you're with someone suffering, that's probably not the best time to remind them of that. This hope that we currently have will one day turn to joy. Unfulfilled hope turns to sorrow. Of course, many of our earthly hopes do result in sorrow. However, when God is the object of our hope, which again is what Paul is talking about here, we have 100% confidence that this hope will turn to joy. So think for just a moment about what Paul is saying here in verse 18. The greatest imaginable sorrow any human has ever endured on earth cannot be compared to the smallest joy in eternity with Christ. This is a truth we should cling to. In moments of trials and tribulation, again, I'm not saying this is easy, but it is true. Again, I don't want to be dismissive of how anyone feels in any moment of suffering, but this truth should allow the Christian to slowly move out of times of despair. Again, what I'm about to say is not something you should say to someone in a moment of suffering. But if a Christian is in perpetual despair, I would question if they take the promises of God seriously. I want to end with one final thought with the goal of building up hope and patience within us as we endure and wait for the eventual return of Christ and our future glory. From nothingness, the triune God of the universe created every aspect of existence. He spoke it into existence. If He can do that, there is nothing He cannot do. Creation was the greatest miracle. So when it comes to our future glory, we can take comfort and hope that it will happen. We must have patience, and we will endure trials and sufferings, but always remember the future glory that awaits you. Now unto Him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us, unto Him be glory in the church by Christ Jesus, throughout all ages, world without end.